Hello and welcome back to the One Take Show podcast. In this episode, we are in conversation with Mr. Aradhya Sethia. He is an incredible guest, and this is one of the finest conversations we've had. He is right now a PhD candidate with Cambridge University, and he is a Cambridge International Scholar. He has had experiences with one of the finest law schools across the world. He has experience with Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, and NLSI in India. And obviously, we talk about his approach towards law school. We talk about what helped him become so successful with law school, especially at the undergraduate degree. And we also talk about writing. We talk about research because we talk about how to assimilate that sense of clarity in your writing. And then we move on to talking about LLM applications. We talk about how to choose a college for your LLM. And then we talk about his research, that is the intersection of party politics as well as constitutional law. So if you're watching this episode, I'm 100% sure you're going to love this conversation. Aradhya is a wonderful, charming guest, and I've had a wonderful time speaking with him, and to which I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity. If you like this episode, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you have any suggestions or feedbacks, write them down in the comment section. I would definitely love to read them. Wow, I'm fumbling with this introduction. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's start with the podcast.
You want something, go get it. Period.
All right, seems like we are recording. Hello, Aradhya. Welcome to the One Take Show. I am so excited for this episode. I was just going through your profile while I was researching for this episode. And after every section of LinkedIn, it just came as a surprise, as another section of inspiration, a huge module for us, all the law students to follow. I am so inspired to have you on this podcast. I'm sure everyone who's going to listen to this episode is going to draw so much inspiration, so much value from your experience. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Wonderful. So first of all, let's start off with this. Where are you joining me from? Like, I understand there's a different time zones that we are speaking with. Where are you exactly joining me from?
Right. So I'm currently in Cambridge, in the UK. Yeah, right. That's where I'm sitting. That's night afternoon, one of the few days when you have good sun outside.
Sure. So is life there easy as of this moment? Because I understand in India, as of this moment, there's this incredible heat wave, and most of the North India is currently in a very, very bad weather. But I hope UK is better in that front.
I believe, and I mean, coming from India, it's difficult to find weather here hot, given that it tends to be quite hot in India. So yeah, I think it's just spring here yet. So it's not very
right.
hot.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So let me start this conversation off with something that I usually do with my guests, because I genuinely believe that learning from your personal experience, especially with your experience in law school, and that too in India, we can learn a lot, especially when it comes to your experience. Because the moment I look at your profile on LinkedIn, there is incredible things that you've done. I mean, with NLS, you have experience. You're the gold medalist HMCY in constitutional law. You're the joint convener of Legal Service Clinic, editor of National Law School India Review, chief editor of Indian Journal of Law and Technology, gold medal in procedural laws. So this automatically becomes a benchmark for anyone to follow. So a very simple question for you: what was the experience in law school in India?
Right. So one of the great treats of doing undergraduate law in India is despite NLS had a lot of structure to it, there's a sense of free flow. So you learn in the not on the basis of every week you have so many readings to do for the class, and of course that's missing. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but there's a lot of lack of structure, which gives you a lot of freedom to learn in very, very different ways. So of course, all this on achievements on the paper are there, but some of the most important learning moments have not come through any of these achievements, but they've come through late night conversations on hostel terraces and in the verandas and whatnot. So yeah, I think that the lack of structure is can work both ways. Can also lead you to sort of not learning much, but it can also help you in figuring out your own ways of learning and enjoying your life. So I had absolutely wonderful years. My best friends continue to be from my undergraduate law school, and some of the foundational ways of thinking I cultivated when I was in undergrad, right? So how to really question and perhaps how to really think about things that you haven't thought through before, not to take authority for granted. All of those things were kind of inculcated while I was doing an undergrad. it was opening of new horizons. Which I guess it's not something very specific to law schools that way. It happens in undergrad is an age where you get exposed to many of these new ideas. You for the first time let to think on your own and all of that. So wasn't in that way very different, but absolutely love the lack of structure.
Absolutely. I think, but irrespectively, I think NLS is still the flag bearer of legal education in India. I mean, when it comes to law schools such as NLS, we always see that there is a different kind of intellectual discourse that surrounds your university that somewhere does not trickle down to all the law schools in India. But the question is, like, for example, you've had a very successful career after law school in India. Like after NLS, you've made it to Yale, you've made it to Oxford, you made it to Cambridge. And of course, like there is a lot of questions that I would love to ask you about that. But primarily, I think there is something that every law student would want to know is there a particular way that you can maneuver through law school in order to somehow guarantee that kind of success after law school? Perhaps like I also ask these questions to people who apply for Rhodes Scholarship. Is there a way that you curate your CV consciously from the very first year, or you pick and choose your endeavors in a law school very consciously that allows you the opening up of all these opportunities? Or is it just that it comes to you naturally throughout the law school and then subsequently you arrive at them?
Yeah, look, now I would honestly very strongly recommend not to try to do that throughout the law school, to curate your CV. And it's not for any idealist reasons, but for your own for your own happiness in some ways, right? Is that it's unique time. Never again in your life will you get time where you can really try out whatever you want for 2 months and 3 months and come out of it and do various kinds of different internships or and sometimes just for the heck of it, right? Just to get experience in that field, and also try and do as many activities as you can. And I try to do that a lot in first few years of my law school for sure, right? And after that, I realized that I figured out what I was more interested in. So I would strongly recommend against curating that from first year. You yourself don't know what to do. Most people don't. There might be a few lucky ones who might know. And I hope you don't, right? Because some of the most, as one of my favorite songs is called "Wear Sunscreen." I think it's by Baz Luhrmann, who's an Australian director. I mean, he has anyway. He produced the song. I don't know who wrote this. Some of the most interesting 20-year-olds I've met are the ones who didn't know what to do with their life when they were 20, right? And some of the most interesting 40-year-olds I meet are the ones who still don't know what to do. So, but when you're 40, it's perhaps much more costly to not know, right? When you're 20, it's less costly. So please don't try to do that. Now, one thing, as we all know that we want to head somewhere, and as a reality check, one thing that I try to very consciously keep in mind, knowing that I might want to be, so to speak, go somewhere to study or be successful, so to speak, is just to maintain high grades. That's or as high as you can, reasonably can, right? Without really harming yourself or without really putting unreasonable expectations or putting unreasonable hours or something like that. But having decent grades keeps many doors open in the future, right? Especially if you want to go into educational field or if you want to study further, particularly for that, right? Apart from that, what activities you not choose, there are many things that, and as I said, there are many things that you do, perhaps some of the most fulfilling ones, which I don't put on my CV, which are not publicly visible. And it's very important to do those things, right? So yeah, I would strongly recommend. Now, law school can teach you like sort of a few core skills, and it's important to at least learn those skills. And apart from that, whatever you do, you can, right? So one skill very important is to research, to look for things, right? Where to find answers to questions, not just legal research, right? Not to just learn legal databases, but also more important, more than like which database you look at, it's important to see what questions would you look for, right? If you're given a broad question to answer, then how do you break down that question into multiple sort of small questions? And even if you just use Google search. So one way is to learn the research, right? And all kinds of research, search for things. Second is to write well, right? And to structure your thoughts properly. And third is to learn at least a little bit of speaking, right? To structure your oral communication as well. And if you learn broadly these three skills, right, in many ways, it might sometimes you learn oral communication through just conversing with your friends, right? And if you learn these three skills, apart from that, I would really recommend try out many things in first few years. And one good thing in India, at least, is that the law schools tend to be, unless you're doing a 3 year plus 3 year, in which case you had an undergrad to try out many things. Law schools tend to be 5 years long, right? So which means that in first few years you can try out many things, and over time then you can concentrate on a few things you want to really you really enjoy, right? Or you really want to be good at. But please don't try to curate. It's one of the sort of very few places and very sort of, and probably unique time in your life, and you can really try out many things, except maybe try to keep your grades decent so that it doesn't close many options. But apart from that, I would strongly recommend against it.
So for sure, I
And
think I was.
when you're doing all these things, one of the things also that like CV makes a lot of sense in hindsight, right? When you're putting down things, and it makes, or like, oh wait, you have done so many things, you're putting all these things down on CV. But when you're doing them, and at least when I was doing them, there was not a clear awareness of what I was doing for CV and what I was not doing for CV, right? And when you put those things down, it's like, oh, maybe I have done enough things for CV. So kind of see CV as a retrospective thing. When you've done things, what things can look good and you can put down on your CV, then seeing it as a prospective exercise of doing things because you can put them down on your CV, right? So that's what I'd recommend.
Absolutely, because from that perspective, it does sound really restrictive, especially for a freshman who's just entered law school and would, let's say, particularly target one area of practice and then only work in that field without ever discovering other various areas that are open for them to at least discover. And I want to circle back on something that you said, and I think I would definitely love to know a little bit more about this from you, because while researching, I've seen that you've written some of the most wonderful works, and I can't talk about every one of them because definitely this episode will stretch out for 5-6 hours, but there is incredible quality in your writing. And with all my reservations against Dr. Peterson, but he says something interesting about the 3 marketable skills, which is articulation, writing, and networking. So you majorly mentioning all 3 of them. If you circle around writing, you said that there's a need that we should develop a skill with writing. Could you tell me a little bit about what's your experience with writing? So, and this is a rather selfish question, because I have, with very specifically with academic writing, I have also felt some restraint, some reservation with that front, right? I've never been very comfortable with that. So if you could tell me what was your experience with writing, and how can someone explore writing, improve it to the extent where it becomes really qualitative as a contribution?
Yeah. So that question is close to my heart, in part because when I entered the law school, I had not written 200 words of my own, which were not mucked up, right? So even when you wrote essays in your high school and all of that, you knew that teachers have given the pointers. And for some reason, I grew up in a small town where this activity was not really promoted as such. It was just, as far as you're good enough to get good marks, it's fine. So you don't really produce your own work much. And most of my extracurricular work, if it all, happened in Hindi. So when I used to give speeches in school, or when I used to even debate, they used to happen mostly in Hindi. But with respect to English writing particularly, I had no major experience. So I kind of learned it during law school. I hadn't written anything of my own, even one full page, so to speak, or at least properly, right? Like at least grammatically correct and making some sense, not just putting some sentences down. So one way to do it is to look, there's no other way but to write more and more, right? There are, of course, a few books you could read, right? So one book that really helped me a lot, right, is this book called Style, Clarity, and Grace, right? So when I started law school, I thought, oh, good writing is the one that's very pompous, right? That's very that's using big words, that's throwing around sort of this high sounding words, and would make me sound very erudite and intellectual in front of my classmates if I use this. And I realized that many times I was just doing that because my thought process was not clear, right? I'm using this high sounding words because I don't know what to say. And I like, oh, people will get it because, this is just like our shared vocabulary. So one way so look, something precedes writing, which is thinking, right? And thinking, you can develop thinking in many ways. You can develop it through reading. You can just develop through, sometimes people develop thinking through daydreaming, right? Whatever it is. So think about your writing process as pretty much, now when I write, sometimes I just write. Most of the writing actually I do is not published anywhere. It doesn't go anywhere. It's because I have developed a way of thinking where I'm just writing to think. right? So think of every sentence you're writing as sort of how it's adding to previous sentence, how it's connected to previous sentence, right? There's of course some grammatical issues, right? But that you perhaps could learn grammar separately. But beyond grammar, a big problem with writing is how it connects, how everything fits well together, right? And when I started, there's this, I don't know if you know about this Hindi film called Masan, and that is the song, right? Man Kasturi Re, and there are these two lines, Bikre Bikre Chand Sa Tehre, Doho Mein Ye Bandh Na Pawe. And that's like whenever I listen to that song and whenever those lines come, I'm like, this is exactly what writing process is. It's painful. Learning to write, how to write, and even once you have learned, it is a bit painful, right? Perhaps after a point when you have really developed mastery over it, it can come to you as a second nature, but it is still painful, right? Because you constantly are trying to connect many sentences together. It's not just things put down, but whether they're also making sense. So thinking of writing as thinking, so considering writing as a thinking process might help, right? And to write, and the best kind of writing is the one which is clear. And the writing that's clear is also the one that's preceded by clear thinking, right? So try to not mask your writing with using big words or sometimes explaining away things. And this old quip, right? Explain it like you'd explain it to a first-year law student, I think is actually, or sometimes even when you're a first-year law student, you'll be told, explain it to me like you're explaining your 10-year-old cousin, right? Is actually a good technique, because it really makes you ask some very foundational questions and perhaps make you think clearly, then explain it away things. So those are some of the tricks I'll sort of give you. And take time in writing. Don't try to produce so much. There is increasing tendency now where people are writing very quickly to get published, etc. But especially when you're a law student, it's good. So I didn't publish much until my fourth year. And many of the things that I published in my fourth, fifth year were mostly the things that I had written before. It's just that I was more I was trying to learn how to write, and I didn't want to publish earlier on. But it's once I was in fourth, fifth year and all, I tried to edit it and got them published because I wanted to publish a few things and put it out in public. But until then, the purpose was to just take time, write, and sometimes just write to learn how to write instead of necessarily putting out things to publish. And law and undergrad is great time for that, because you have no pressure as far as you maintain decent grades. You know, anything else can be added much later, right? CVs can be built much later. So, and it gives you a lot of time to do that.
Right, absolutely. I think I have a question, but this might sound very naive, but who cares? I have to ask you this because I'm going to use this opportunity. And I'll also tell you why I'm asking you this question. My question is, why is writing important? So I've just learned how can someone improve with writing. And everyone knows on a preliminary surface level basis that writing is important. But when it comes to law, legal education, or legal prowess, how much is writing important? So what kind of an impact does it have on either your branding or your presence or your knowledge? Or so why is it that an individual should strive to write? And the reason why I ask you this question is people usually ask me, why should one moot? Is it because people give you jobs because you moot? And I said, my understanding is no, it's not because people give you jobs. It's because you get to learn how to research, and then you get to learn how to argue. And those are essential skills. So from that perspective, why should one, especially a law student, focus on writing? And why is writing such an integral part of this legal industry?
Right. Look, I think that legal industry is not even a necessary part there. Like, so just the fact that you're doing a law degree, right? You might want to use it in many ways. And that's increasingly happening. Law schools in India, at least, are not the place where people are only coming to become lawyers. It's kind of considered as a skill training, which you can use in many other places. People are doing many things. Now, doesn't matter what kind of professional job you do, right? Law schools, for instance, don't teach you how to do deep empirical analysis, right? It doesn't really teach you how to work with numbers. It doesn't give you any qualitative research experience. It doesn't teach you how to go and conduct interviews with people and, do ethnography and all of those things, right? So it doesn't give you those skills. Now, those skills might be there in other disciplines that you might do, right? So economics might have some of that. Anthropology might have some of that, etc. So what is it that you're really bringing on table for whatever job you're doing, right? It's that you could perhaps think in a more structured way, right? You could communicate in a clearer way, at least written form of it. Probably most jobs might not involve oral communication, but at least written forms of it, right? So And as I said, learning to write well sometimes, and it's not necessary again, right? It's just that it can also help you think in a clearer way, and it has definitely helped me do that. And it is in no way necessary that you write academic pieces or that you necessarily do sort of legal writing per se, but just that you can communicate a sensible idea, or you can communicate sensibly in a written form, will be relevant to you even outside legal industry, even if you choose not to go into legal industry. So that's just one skill that law school teaches you, and it's all totally fine to not learn that. But but if you're at all relying on your degree and what does that degree give, it's probably those are the few skills it gives you, and writing is very essential to it. But yeah, you could totally I can imagine people, and I have some friends who totally abandoned anything to do with legal industry or even allied industries, right? And the writing is perhaps not even important to them. So that's fine. And it's I wouldn't exaggerate it. I wouldn't say it's necessary for everyone. But if you want to use your legal skills in any way, right, outside even law, then clear writing is definitely something that people might trust lawyers for, or at least structured writing. Sometimes it's not clear. We often use quite a few jargons, but yeah.
Right, definitely. And I think from the litigation perspective, because that is one that I'm, as of this stage in my own naivety, I'm the most comfortable with, writing definitely plays a huge role, especially when it comes to drafting pleadings and everything, especially when it goes before the courts. It creates a really very, very different kind of an impact when it comes from a lawyer who has a very beautifully drafted document, and you read those pleadings and then you understand, okay, fine, this is a quality work. And then there is another set of pleadings where you would clearly see that there is a fractured sense of logical flow of arguments that I think definitely creates an impact. So there, I think writing becomes extremely important. With that, I think
it's in a way a service, right? You're saving judicial time by writing
absolutely.
It's kind of a service to the system if you're writing clearly as well. Yeah.
Right. And it also becomes a medium of self-reflection as well, as you said. Like, if you want to communicate properly, writing becomes one of your essential tools. And with that, I think one of the questions that I would love to ask you is, before I ask you about the contrast in the legal education, as you mentioned before as well, what was your experience with education in India? My question is, like, when you start applying to law schools outside India, especially to possibly the most reputed law schools across the world, Yale, and then subsequently Oxford, Cambridge, or other law schools, was there any particular strategy in your mind with either your SOPs, LORs, or with your essays that somehow, or personal interviews, that somehow helped you to gain that one particular edge, or something that worked very uniquely for you? One strategy that could have come to your aid that completely changed the game. Was there any such experience with these application processes?
No, I wish I knew. Look, I can only reverse engineer and think, or try to reverse engineer and think, right, what might have worked. But unlike Hamilton, I was not in the room where it happened, so I don't know what exactly worked. But one way to see your application, and that really helped me at least to gain clarity about how I want to approach and whether that worked or not, I can't say, is to see your SOP, statement of interest, etc., as a case you make. See it as a pleading, right? And say your CV or all the other proofs you have in terms of your academic, your transcripts, your CVs, all the documents that you submit along with it, right? Sometimes writing proof, etc., as evidence. So if you're a lawyer, think of your statement of interest as trying to make a case, a very structured case for why you deserve admission there, right? And in some ways, you're also making a case for why university also deserves you. That why are you a right fit, right? Why you deserve an admission, while also university is the right place for you to be there. And think of other documents you have as evidence, right? And how you use that evidence you have within the pleadings as kind. But there's no specific strategy. One thing that might help is to do good research about the universities, right, where you're applying. Normal things like don't use a standard SOP everywhere. Try to see what is so special about the university and how you can really cater to it, etc. But there's a lot of luck involved. So once, actually much more than any of this, probably the strategy that helps is to ultimately not take the process too seriously. To come to terms with it that, look, it's there's a lot of luck involved, and none of this is a judgment on you, on your abilities or anything. It's a major part just who's there in the room selecting you sometimes, right? As I said, one thing that helps you is to keep your grades decently, like reasonably high, not some extraordinary grades or something, because anything else around that you can still make a case, right? But your sort of grades are one thing that everyone in the class is participating in, and that's one thing that everyone will look at. All other activities cater to what you are more interested in or what you can make a case for, right? Whether it's academic writing or it's debating or it's mooting or whatever you do. But yeah, apart from that, there is, to be honest, I was not sure if I want to apply for masters until like towards the end of my 4th year, beginning of 5th year. That's when I thought, oh, maybe I should apply. It was at the back of my mind that I might want to apply once your grades are decently high. People do tell you you should go for LLM and stuff, but I was not sure if I want to straight away apply. So there was not some major strategy going around as such. It's just one thing that I did, because I was applying to Yale, which is and which is my first choice as well, and which is very academic. And I thought maybe getting a few papers that I have written beforehand published might help, right? So I then opened all the project folders and saw, okay, which papers might be good enough to send anywhere for publication. And towards the end of 4th year, 5th year, I sent those papers were there with a minor editing. I had to just send them for publications, but I didn't bother about publishing them before. But because I was applying for LLM, I needed more evidence on my CV to show that, look, I'm not just saying I can write, but someone has approved that I can write well. But apart from that, there's no major strategy as such. Yeah.
Right. That's very interesting. I do have a question. Like, I think it's been a long time I've been trying to find an answer to this, and I've received different sort of interpretations of this question from different people. But how do you pick a law school after your undergrad? Obviously, it's an exercise that comes from certain kind of a privilege, because the application processes are very expensive as well. And for people to go through that process, they would require certain kind of investment. So for anyone who is making a hard choice of, let's say, applying to only a couple of law schools and maybe not to multiple law schools to increase the chances, how do you suggest that someone picks their law school? Let's say if they're interested in one particular area of law, may it be constitutional, comparative constitutional studies. How does someone pick a law school? Is it by the virtue of the faculty, alumnus, legal product, or the studies resource that goes on? How do you pick a law school after undergrad?
Yeah. I mean, a little bit of all of that, right? But at least in my case, and I guess that's true in many people's case, funding was one of the most important factors. So I was quite sure within broadly the kind of law schools I'd applied to, the place, like if multiple universities are giving me equal funding, then the question is different. But if not, then I'll just go with the university that's covering as much as possible for my full tuition. So I had that option, and look, it comes down to, in my case, for instance, I had to choose. It was a choice between UK and US at some level, and there are different models of LLMs, and it depends on what you prefer to do more, right? But I wanted to do my own original work more and sort of write more papers while doing LLMs, because I'd written projects, etc., and I'd written so many exams in undergrad that I wanted to write more of my own work and use my time there to learn from professors, get advice from them, and that was more possible to do in the US than in the UK. To learn academic writing much better, and also sort of explore your own ideas. And that's where I explored the idea, actually, which I'm currently doing PhD on. So that was a major factor for me. But look, ultimately, all these places have great resources abroad, right? I mean, at least good universities in the US and the UK and some European universities have a lot of resources. They have fairly broadly very similar kind of faculty members. There are differences, of course, but it's also about what you make of it. So I think for me, it was very clear. I'll go whoever gives me money. I was not ready to spend so much money, and perhaps I might not have done LLM if I hadn't received all money, right? So, but apart from that, it comes down to, especially between US and UK, that's a choice, right? That because there are very two different models of LLMs. But between these universities, there is in the UK, for instance, there are minor differences between different LLMs, or in the US there are minor differences, but it becomes also kind of personal choice. If you're doing very niche area of law and there are a specific person in that university you might want to work with, sometimes it's also about the city you want to live in for a year, all those choices, right? So there's no general sort of 3-factor answer to it. It will depend very much on what you're looking for from your LLM. Another important consideration is whether you want to get a qualification in a country after LLM and try to stay work there, right? So that might change it a little bit, as opposed to, say, just getting education for a year. The two are very different considerations again.
Right. That's a very fascinating answer. I'm sure this kind of a conversation is extremely required for everyone who's at least in their third or fourth year in the law school, because usually we do target let's say LLM opportunities based on what our seniors have done, and we get inspiration from them. And I'm sure because of internet, people are a lot more connected and they can always reach out to the seniors across the law schools. But I do understand that when it comes down to law schools, which are possibly not in the top tier ones, that do not have that kind of a precedent set for themselves, for them, I think the juniors require a very comprehensive sort of a conversation to be presented to them in order for them to even explore this idea. For example, my law school has, for the first time, I believe, explored the idea of vacation scheme, where my dear friend Siddhanta Ahuja has, for the first time, I think, cleared vacation schemes. Whereas this vacation scheme as an idea is very commonplace when it comes to NLS, NEJS, or NALSA for that matter. So I think this segment of the conversation is absolutely wonderful for anyone who's listening to it. Before we continue forward, Aradhya, it's been 25-30 minutes we've been having this conversation. Would you like to take a break, get some water, or do you want us to continue?
Anything, whatever you prefer.
All right, perfect. So all the viewers and listeners, if you're listening to this podcast, you've been listening to it for about 25-30 minutes. You want to get a glass of water and come back and join us. I'll be counting to 3, 3, 2, 1. Hi, we are back. All right, so we were talking about Aradhya's experience with LLM, and we were talking about his experience with law schools across the world. What I wanted to ask you is very particularly with respect to your contrast that you might have experienced with respect to educational quality, or maybe the educational setups when it was in law school in India in LLS, and with the education that you received across the world. Was there a contrast so bright that somehow there is a lacuna in Indian education that needs to be filled? Because I understand the US legal education system sort of functions very uniquely, quite differently from what we have ours. There's cold calling and there's a different preparatory setup for every lecture that happens. Was there an education setup that shocked you and something that you would want to bring back to India in the hindsight?
Nothing shocked me really. Well, one thing perhaps, I think it's a different model of undergrad education, right? So, I mean, I also teach undergrads here now, and something, as I just mentioned at the beginning, right, that there's a lot of structure here for like how your university time is scheduled, so to speak. Like you have, so for instance, here you have tutorials or supervisions, as they're called in Cambridge, almost every week, and you have to prepare for them in advance, write an essay, etc. Right? So that definitely inculcate some rigor. But I was also thinking, if I were an undergrad here, I would not get all the free time to really go on those explorations of some of the topics I got interested in, because I'm just constantly following the deadlines, right? So in some ways, perhaps there's a balance to be struck, right? That sometimes these universities also have too much structure going around, right? Sometimes you could feel in India that this is almost no structure. There should be at least some structure to your education, right? So perhaps that, but more importantly, I think research is something that we don't take very seriously, and at least in law schools in India, right? I don't want to say it across the board for other disciplines, and we're doing some amazing work, but in law schools, undergrads are actually producing some amazing work. And I kind of disagree with some of the people who think undergrads shouldn't be doing academic writing and all of that. I think they're doing some of the best work in India is coming very interestingly from undergrad students, and I'm that's totally amazing. But as such, there is no sort of at least when I was studying, there's no culture of having those forums where you can discuss your research, where it can, not just as a student, right? Even within faculty members, even within scholars, and I believe it might be a matter of time. Over time, we will realize that you do require a research culture, not just to sort of copy Western universities or to catch up with them. That's not the purpose. But we do have burning questions in India, right? For which you do require, of course, day-to-day political bickerings on many policy issues, but you also require people who are doing deep, thoughtful work on some of the very important questions, right? And of course, other disciplines are doing some great work, but you also need law scholars, particularly. There's so many issues in Indian law which we have no clue about how to even think about them, right? Courts deal with them day to day, on a day-to-day basis. Lawyers deal with them on a day-to-day basis, but we just don't know how to really think about them in a more systematic way, so that it's one thing to practice law, but it's another to also shape law or to give coherence to that practice, right? And that also gives long-term efficiency to the practice of that area of law, even though in a day-to-day practice you go along with what's happening in the courts and lawyers. So it's needed not to catch up with some list of the universities here, but for our own sake of having more clarity about many areas of law. So I believe that's one thing, right? The research culture within the faculty might really help. And perhaps less contact hours with teachers. We have one of the ways of disciplining students, undergrad students in India is to, and which is true when I was an undergrad, is to make students wake up every morning, go to class. Many students will just sleep or do other things. We've all done that. Perhaps fewer contact hours and giving more space for research, and also students more time to do more thoughtful work rather than just following a daily timetable, right? That might help. But as such, look, there are many, a lot of these issues have to do with resources, right? Just if you have more resources, I can say, oh, look, you can have access to this, you can have access to that. And it might be a matter of time that we probably might have those many resources. We didn't have any of those, right? A couple of decades back, we were kind of lucky that we did law school, at least where we studied, or you and I studied around the time when we had at least those resources available. I have heard stories from decades ago, and to access one book, you had to travel cities to, when you're doing a moot and there's an international law book, people will travel across cities and across India to get one or two books, right? But those are matters of resources, I believe, which is only inevitable that over time will at least reach that gap of resources, right? But it's more of a matter of culture, which I think we can cultivate even with limited resources we have.
Right. I think for sure, like, there are definitely certain limitations, but so long as you talk about the resources, I do believe, and I do concur with your point, that ultimately there is a growth with respect to how undergrads are performing. We do see a lot of qualitative work coming out from undergrads as well, and definitely there is a lot that can be improved. But with that, I would like to take this conversation possibly to the last segment of our conversation, is your current work profile, essentially what you're currently working with. And you've told me that you're working at an intersection between party politics as well as constitutional studies. And this is very, very fascinating, because I would definitely love to know what, in principle, is this theme or ideological conscious thought essentially means to you, and how would you convey it to someone in order to somehow summarize what is your area of work, what is it that you're researching on? Because I've read papers and articles that you've written where you've talked about quite extensively about what is the impact of, or the relationship between, the party politics and the constitution. There's one article we've talked about Indian constitution, not very explicitly mentioning the political parties, but how political parties playing a very significant role in the constitutional development. So what could you tell us about this area of research for you?
Right. So I think the reason I got into this research is very circuitous. I've always been interested in politics and discussions around politics, but when I was studying law, it kind of convinced me that, look, constitutional law is something different. Constitutional law is above this day-to-day politics, right? It's not about political parties. It's about legislature, executive, judiciary, federal, union, federal, state relations, etc., fundamental rights. Like, so it's some way it tries to place itself above the level of sort of party politics, so to speak. And but the street view of constitution is different. If anyone who hasn't read the text of constitution, or if you're not a lawyer, they would be surprised that if you tell them that, oh, look, constitution has nothing to do with political parties, they'll be like, what? They run the country, right? They run all constitutional institutions. And what are you saying? the constitution has to do something with political parties, and that surprised me. The original Indian constitution didn't mention political parties, neither did any ordinary law. So they just had kind of extra legal existence. And I came to this issue as more as someone interested in constitutional law. That for long there's of course great discussion on fundamental rights in India, right? What different rights mean, what different restrictions mean. And there is discussion on some separation of powers, federalism related issues. But there's clearly an elephant in the room. Political parties really decide what policies go through, how even relations between different branches of state work, right? Between state and the union, between parliament and executive. Many of our concerns with, look, parliament doesn't even, it's a rubber stamp as it's often claimed as a result of how political parties operate in India, right? So that's what I am researching on, as to how, if we put political parties, right, at the center of the constitution and try to understand constitution through the operation of political parties in India, how our understanding of constitution through this one additional factor might change so drastically. So legislature executive relationship or parliamentary accountability of the executive would then mostly appear like accountability of the executive to backbencher MPs of your party or the opposition, right? And that opening, it's kind of lifting the wheel of this constitutional abstraction of legislature and executive, opening and seeing them through party politics really reveals how constitution works. And perhaps then our solution to many of the problems that the operation of democracy and the operation of parliamentary government in India is, that might be different if we put parties at the center. It might not. Many of the solutions are not discussed much. What to do with parties' internal processes, right? What to do with mainly that, right? What to do with parties' internal processes. Mostly we end up discussing a little bit about electoral funding, right? So electoral bonds are the big issue, and I've written a little bit about them before. But apart from that, we tend to them completely ignore. There's this American political scientist who I read when I was doing an LLM. He said, look, though politicians might know a little bit about law, lawyers need not know anything about politics, right? And that kind of hit me. Like, wait, is that true? And he meant politics in a very particular sense of party politics, not in equality and justice kind of politics, but exactly how politics operate. And that's in many ways true. In law school, we barely taught about party politics, right? We barely taught about what are different party systems in India, what are how Indian politics has developed, etc. And Indian constitution history is, I believe, incomplete without that. So yeah, part of my work is tracking that history, and part of my work is also prescriptive about how we could think about improving political parties to improve the working of Indian constitution. This is mostly to do with creating more spaces for participation sometimes, but also recognizing that actually our constitution can't work without political parties, or any democratic constitution can't work. So yeah, it might seem that it's primarily because my interest in politics that I'm turning to political parties, but actually it's my curiosity about constitutional law that led me to the question of political parties as my PhD thesis.
Right. Wonderful. I think I would definitely not ask you to somehow list down all the potential solution issues that you've identified for your research, because that's a conversation I would definitely have with you separately when we have the thesis, and then we are picking out each and every section and we are going into the depths and we have all the research with us. But right now, could you identify for us, like for example, you mentioned that there are certain solutions that need to come about when we start researching into this area as to what could be an overlap or the intersection between constitutional principles, as well as what would be the impact of assimilation of the idea of political parties existing and influencing a democratic setup into what laws and legislations would function like, impact of the same on executive. What are the certain issues from a perspective, obviously, I mean, something that you see in the future that needs to be identified and definitely work towards? What are certain issues that you could identify for our audience that find these are certain issues that right now you are dealing with, and these are potential solutions that you might have identified? Maybe a couple of them, one or two, but is there one or two issue that you really feel very strongly about when it comes down to that kind of an impact?
Right. So take one of the examples, right, which we kind of take it for granted that would happen in the smoke-filled rooms, and sometimes it does happen. Doesn't matter. Even in countries which have extensive laws and parties, the candidate selection, right? How parties can select candidates, and we might think, look, what can you do about it? It's the party leader who will just select based on who they like. Right. Sometimes they might field a few surveys to figure out who's a good candidate, but that's it. So one of the issues that really interests me is like how parties select candidates, right? And how there could be minimal institutional processes within parties. So what about the role of party members, right, who are in that particular locality? How they could play a better role, right, in parties making those decisions. Another is the role of parties in parliamentary business, right? So how do we define so anti-defection amendment, as many of your listeners might know, is instituted in the constitutional text. But we barely ask the question of should parties follow any process before disciplining their members, right? They are disciplining the constitutional offices in the form of members of parliament, right? And we almost have no processes for how parties discipline their members. Any party leader can just issue a whip, right? And that counts automatically as disqualification sometimes. I mean, if the speaker rules so, if the speaker decides so, then it counts as disqualification. So for instance, disciplinary actions that parties take, what processes could further improve it? Candidate selection, right? Leadership elections. Now, many parties, none of the Indian party has any process for sort of members having any role to play in leadership election quite often, right? Or leadership selection. So some of those processes, and look, I mean, a major problem working in this area is that foxes guard the hen house, right? It's just politicians control the legislative business, and why would they control the parties, and why would party leaders introduce any of those changes? And my response to that would be that we will sometimes be surprised how policy windows open up. The problem is that even if that window opens up right now in India, we don't have any answer as to what parties could do, right? If in the future, a few years down the line, if that option opens up that we could do something to reform Indian political parties, I hope that there will be a start, that there will be a conversation starter at least, that yes, this provides some lines and perhaps very bad answers, but at least there are some questions worth asking to see in what ways can we reform Indian parties if that policy window opens up in the future. So these are basically the ideas that many processes which happen within the parties, right, within the four corners of political parties, are exactly the processes through which the working of constitutional system is decided. So how do we open up that wheel, and some of the intra-party processes are made accountable, accountable either to the law generally or to regulatory processes, right? That's where I'm headed, and it will take another year or so. Perhaps I'll have a more well-formed answers, but these are the questions I'm looking at.
Definitely, they sound. I think you've. So long as starting a conversation around this is concerned, I personally am so curious about this. I'm going to start reading more and more. Maybe I'll start reading your articles way more carefully and start reading into the words, finding more and more substance. I sincerely apologize for the fluctuation of the electricity. We live in Uttar Pradesh. This is a commonplace activity here. Power cuts keep on happening. Maybe something of that sort also can be assimilated into that theme, but very, very exciting and very interesting. I think I do myself, while I was listening to your explanation, I think your experience with this research, I started somehow coming up with a lot of questions of my own. Not the questions which would be valid, but I think a lot of strands of questions. For example, would there be an overlap of constitutionality or constitutionalism over whatever pragmatic deontological methods are being adopted by political parties, or whatever is being accepted by the society in total right now? Because more often than not, we don't really question the practices of the political parties just by giving them a leeway into whatever the current practice is, or whatever socially accepted norms are, whatever pragmatically accepted behavior is. So of course, like there's a lot of areas we can cover, but definitely an area of research that everyone would be very, very excited about, especially the ones who are interested in constitutional law, constitutionalism in general. And for a lot of my friends who personally I know are very, very interested in politics, would definitely find so much interest in your work. And apart from that, also, I think the conversation we have had today, from everything, the writing, your experience in law school, your perspective on research, your perspective on colleges, would be extremely, extremely valuable for everyone who's watching or listening to this podcast. Before we wrap this up, Aradhya, do you have any closing remarks for our viewers or listeners today?
Well, not really, but thank you, Kaustav. And I see that I've seen some of your episodes, and you are really an amazing, emerging to be an amazing podcast host.
Thank you.
So I wish you good luck, and I'm sure this is really going to add to the experience of Indian law students. And yeah, thanks for inviting me, and great stuff hosting the podcast.
Absolutely. I think I'm really honored to have this opportunity, and you're an amazing guest. Was absolutely a perfect conversation. I look forward to another opportunity to host you and to bring about more and more conversations from your experience. Thank you so much for joining me. I had a wonderful time. I hope you had a good time too.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Bye.